Hello, my name is Pete Doyle. I'm the National Health and Safety Manager for Citation, and my presentation is with regards to getting risk assessments right. During this presentation, I'm going to cover off two major areas with regards to risk assessments. The first is health and safety, the legal essentials. And then secondly, I'm going to spend a bit of time going through how to create a risk assessment. So, health and safety, why does it apply to you? And more importantly, do businesses need to consider health and safety? In the first element, you can see on the screen, there is a moral obligation with regards to health and safety in the workplace. And everybody in the workplace has a moral obligation to both their employees and vice versa from the employees to their employer. Everybody should be doing everything they can to prevent and minimize incidents and accidents. There is a legal responsibility as well, and this is commonly referred to when people point to the health and safety law posters that you will see on display in virtually all premises. That there are various elements with regards to the legal, which I'll cover off in a little more detail shortly. And then thirdly, there is the financial implication for health and safety. Good organisations generally have very robust systems in place where everybody involved follows a process and knows what they're doing. Organisations that have lots of health and safety issues tend to be hit with financial penalties, whether that be through enforcement agencies taking action against them, loss of reputation, and other circumstances such as prosecution, civil or criminal. So, what does the law say? There are two distinct streams here. In the first case, there's the criminal legislation, and this is generally derived by Acts of Parliament, regulations written under those acts, and guidance and approved codes of practice issued by various bodies, such as the Health and Safety Executive. The most common Act of Parliament most people refer to is the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act, and most of the regulations sit underneath that Act. The people that use the criminal element will generally be prosecutors such as the Health and Safety Executive, the Environment Agency, Fire Authority, and Local Authority. Far more common is the civil claims, and this is where a case is brought by an individual claiming a tort of negligence, and these are usually heard in the county or high court. Civil claims are far more likely to be seen by organisations because there is a lower burden of proof. However, completing good health and safety risk assessments will help defend you in both of these cases. How do you defend yourself from action? By following simple and consistent steps, most organisations are able to prevent incidents occurring in the first place. However, where issues do come along, they are then better able to mitigate against any ongoing action and be able to demonstrate what they have done. So by having safe working procedures in place, ensuring that all your staff are trained and suitably competent, considering the hazards and risks and balancing those, and then completing a risk assessment where you find there's something significant, you have taken most of the major steps. The vital element of this is communicate regularly with all involved. And as I'm about to go into, we'll follow the process of doing risk assessments. So risk assessments. I've entitled this Debunking the Myth. They are a legal requirement under the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. And as such, a risk assessment should be conducted every time you are considering a task. It is not always a requirement of the legislation that you write these down. However, what you should do at all times is make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the significant risks to anybody's health and safety. So that can be the individuals within your employ, or it could be others, visitors or people that are entering that area. You're required to identify the hazards, and this is something that has the potential to cause harm. And often this is where people get confused with what is a hazard and what is a risk. And hopefully I'll explain some of that as we move through the show. Then you quantify the risk. How likely is that hazard that you've previously identified likely to cause harm? And that can be harm to an individual, a property, premise, or an organization. And finally, you conduct the assessment, noting the existing controls in place that are already there to prevent those who are in harm's way and how they prevent them being at further risk. We now move on to the 5 steps to risk assessment. In this process, you first of all, in step 1, identify the hazards. Once you've identified the hazards, decide who might be harmed and how. That's step 2. In step 3, evaluate the risks, and once determined, decide on what precautions should be in place and ensure that they're followed. Step 4, record your findings and implement them. And in step 5, review your assessment and update as and when necessary. I'm now going to walk through each of these individual steps. In step 1, we identify the hazards. So a hazard is something with the potential to cause harm. And often people confuse a hazard with likelihood and so on and so forth. But if you think about this in the simple process that you need to think what can cause harm to an individual or to the premise. I would always strongly recommend you review any accident incident records you have, because that will give you an indicator of what has gone wrong in the past, or in some circumstances, what has nearly happened. So organisations that record their near hits or near misses will have a wealth of information here that they can utilise. If there's equipment being used, what are the hazards that have been identified by the manufacturer? If you're using a bandsaw, how do you safely operate the bandsaw? Should there be precautions in place? How do you change the blade? If you are using simple office equipment, what are the procedures, such as using a microwave oven and so on and so forth? So once those have been taken into consideration, involve those in part of your risk assessment. Have there been any issues with this task and process in the past? And again, this refers back to the accident and incident records. It may be that people have an experience of something not quite being right. So take that into consideration. Involve the staff in the process. They have the information. And often people forget that the people that are doing the task have the greatest knowledge of what can go wrong and what shortcuts they are taking. So often from an employer's perspective, getting the staff involved will actually make the process far easier, and you get a lot more buy-in because they're involved. And then finally, I would always recommend physically observing the practices. Are they doing what they say they're doing? Truthfully, people will always be, when they're observed, they will take the action seriously and they will do what they're supposed to do. But sometimes you may need to review and say, I'll have another look at that in a short while. Step 2 is decide who might be harmed and how. And this is seriously to consider who is in harm's way during the task. Obviously, you will have staff that are operating the procedure or using the piece of equipment. You may well have contractors or subcontractors that are doing this on your behalf. Or there may be others in the premises that are contractors and subcontractors that your actions may impact. So you need to consider them. And finally, you need to consider members of the public and visitors. If you're operating in an open area, make sure that you are considering how can others get into this area? Do I need to barricade? Do I need to consider other actions to keep them out of harm's way? There is also a requirement to consider people who are deemed to be vulnerable. Often this is young and inexperienced workers. They've yet to build up the understanding of how to do a task. And typically these are people that are under the age of 18. And there's a major group of pregnant workers. Often people don't consider that when a pregnant worker, their circumstances change during the pregnancy. It may be a process that you're using is perfectly safe and adequate when nobody is bearing child. But when an individual is pregnant, that there may be other exposures such as chemicals and such like that you then need to consider. The third step is evaluate the risks and decide on the precautions. So a risk, simply put, is the chances of that harm actually happening. You often have things that could have massive potential to cause serious damage, but the likelihood of it happening are actually very, very low because of the controls that are in place and the practices that people are following routinely. I would always recommend you rank the hazards by the severity. So those that are most likely to have the most dramatic impact, deal with those first, because as you are evaluating those risks and understanding what your precautions are, you are probably going to deal with an awful lot of other things at the same time. After identifying the hazard, what is the standard practice? It often transpires that people are following a set process because they've been trained how to do something. So incorporate whatever that process is into your risk assessment. So for argument's sake, if you have a reach forklift truck, make sure that the individual that's using that vehicle is competent and has been trained how to use it. If you're bringing in new employees and they say that they've been experienced in a piece of equipment, get them to demonstrate it to you and then incorporate those standard practices into the risk assessment. Recognize where there are training requirements. As mentioned earlier with regards to the forklift truck, you would not put somebody on a forklift truck until they've been able to demonstrate competence. We often hear of people saying that they've done a forklift awareness training course. That's brilliant. You just need to make sure that they've done the training and awareness on the vehicle that they're going to be using. Are the precautions sufficient? Often people put precautions into a risk assessment that would be in the ideal circumstances. Please do not put precautions in there that you are not going to undertake. So again, this comes back down to being suitable and sufficient. If you are doing something, record it. If you think you should be doing something, do not record it until you actually start putting that process in place. And then measure the risk of residual harm. On the right hand side here, you see a simple impact against likelihood. I would always suggest that if you believe an item is still high risk after the precautions that are in place, you need to review your risk assessment. You should be doing everything possible to reduce the risk to, at worst, to be a medium risk, but ideally to be a low risk at all times. And this is used by a simple multiplication of the most likely severity of injury and against the harm. Once you've undertaken the previous 3 steps, the 4th step is to record your findings and implement them. Now, I would always suggest that you actually keep a record of any risk assessment. And often people say, well, that can be verbal, but it is difficult to defend what actions you've taken if there's no documentary evidence in place. There are many, many different ways of doing this. Those who are clients of Citation, you will have access through our online tools to be able to utilize those to help you document your risk assessments and to generate reminders of when they should be in place and when they should be reviewed. Once the document's recorded and you've then got it available for people, communicate it with everybody involved in the task. That predominantly is going to be the staff that are undertaking the task, but it may also be others that are impacted by it. As mentioned earlier, if they are working with subcontractors, make sure that they are aware of what your precautions are, because it may be that something you are doing is not something that they've considered previously. And where possible, get an acknowledgement that people have understood and have taken into consideration the risk assessment or the document that you've presented to them. Again, there's many different ways of doing this. You can do this as a toolbox talk, sit people down, spend 5-10 minutes going through a process with them and record the fact that they attended that training. Always, if possible, get a signature, but if not, a simple diary note is often sufficient. Finally, you review your risk assessment and update if necessary. Sounds very straightforward, but monitoring and reviewing your risk assessment makes sure that you are keeping up to date and making sure that circumstances, if they change, would be changed within your risk assessment to reflect that. If there are issues identified, address them immediately. And once you've addressed a problem that you've identified, ensure that everybody that's involved is made aware. This would be a simple process of saying we have changed the risk and the assessment is this, and then make sure that everybody that's involved in that process is aware of those changes. I would always recommend you set a regular review. Generally, this is annual review, but it may be more frequent. It could be that a process that you're undertaking needs to be reviewed every time you do it because of other interactions, and the dynamics of the assessment are that you need to change the assessment every single time you do it because a process has slightly changed. Or it could be that others are involved in the process that weren't previously there. So again, set a date for review and stick to it. And they should always be reviewed if there's been an incident or accident. This is a step that people often get wrong, in that they persevere with a risk assessment knowing that there's been an incident. If an incident has occurred, always review your risk assessment, and if it's still valid, then that's fine. Something else failed, but it's useful to make sure that you have a record of that. So now to a practical example. So shall we do a risk assessment? I'm going to suggest that we do something that is so unusual no one should have experience of it. Therefore, I'm going to suggest we do a shark in a swimming pool. Hopefully, if you bear with me on this, you will understand the simple process of actually identifying what the hazards and the likelihoods are. So, an impractical example of a risk assessment. What if there is a shark in a swimming pool? So first, identify what the hazard is. Now, hopefully nobody's ever come across this before, but there is a perception that sharks are extremely dangerous animals and that they kill loads of people, and that's because people have seen films such as Jaws. In truth, there are approximately 8 people killed by sharks throughout the world every year. Now, I appreciate that that's quite a shock for the families that are involved in those circumstances. But if I was to say to you that 150 people are killed every year by coconuts falling and hitting them, that puts into context how dangerous sharks actually are. In their natural environment, they are not dangerous. Similarly, coconuts, when they are chopped up and placed in front of you in a meal, are not dangerous. So it's a matter of considering what is the hazard. So sharks have very, very sharp teeth. Most people have equipment that, if not treated properly or handled properly, will have the ability to cause damage. Bandsaws being a perfect example of that. Machinery where the guards are removed and deliberately removed, that's the hazard. So once you've identified the hazards, look at what the control measures are and how are you going to prevent that. So using the example of the shark in the swimming pool, make sure that there's separation. Make sure that there's barriers to stop people going into the pool. Then look at who can be harmed. Now this could be you and your team or your family if it's your family swimming pool. So how do you prevent that? As I mentioned earlier, exclusion areas would be a perfectly good solution. But you need to feed your shark. So again, it could be a third party coming in to do that. So again, identify subcontractors, the gentleman that cleans your pool. So make sure that you're looking at them and how they are going to interact with your shark. Assess the risk and take action. You know, again, this comes down to sensible precautions. So if you've got precautions that are in place, that the shark, nobody will get in the swimming pool with a shark, and that's sensible. And you record that. So you minimize the opportunity for people to get into that pool. The likelihood of somebody getting in the pool is probably very low, but the outcome is very, very drastic. If somebody's in there with the shark, they are likely to be attacked and cause serious damage. So it's a matter of simply recording what you do and how you do it. Finally, record your findings. And once you've done that, circulate, post to everybody that's involved, make sure that they're aware of it. That can be done electronically, it can be done by paper, it can be done by signage, and then regularly review and update. It may be as your shark gets older, it no longer poses such a risk. It could be that you've changed circumstances. You've decided you no longer want to have a shark in your swimming pool. Therefore, having a risk assessment for a redundant item is pointless. So review and update. And I would always strongly urge you that when you update any form of risk assessment, keep the previous version, whether that be electronically or in paper copy, because if somebody has an incident at that time, you need to know what was in place and what was pertinent at that point in time. So even though I've used an absolutely absurd example, by considering what is going to hurt people and who and how they're going to get hurt, hopefully you understand how to do a simple risk assessment. So in summary, there are penalties for the lack of compliance with health and safety legislation. And risk assessments are often your first line of defense, making sure that people understand what is available to them and how they're supposed to undertake a task. There is criminal and civil action, and it can be applicable to any event. Often you can face both. If there's a criminal prosecution, you may also still face a civil prosecution. However, you are far more likely to face civil action, and be aware that there is a much lower burden of proof. It is not beyond all reasonable doubt. There just has to be doubt that did the organisation undertake the task in the way in which they're supposed to. And where they're found to be potentially significant issues, record your findings and communicate them with all concerned. This is vital. It is pointless doing a risk assessment and leaving it on the shelf in the office when the individuals that are undertaking the task are blissfully unaware of it. So please ensure that everybody that's involved in the operation has a copy of the risk assessment and has been made aware of it. And then finally, regularly review and pay attention to near hits. Often you will get indicators that something is not quite right because you have a lot of near hits or near misses. So please pay attention to what's actually occurring in the workplace. That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, if you're a client of Citation, please feel free to get in touch with either myself or my colleagues on the Health and Safety Helpline. And the number for that is 0345 844 4848. Should you not yet be a client of Citations and wish to have further information as to how we can help you and support you, please get in touch with our team on 0345 844 1111. Thank you very much for your attention.